In this lecture, I'm going to focus on a single painting, Raphael's self-portrait with a friend in the Musée du Louvre in Paris. This picture was painted in Rome in the months just prior to Raphael's death on the 6th of April 1520, age just 37. Before one can begin to interpret Raphael's double portrait, it's necessary to understand the range of his activities in the last few years of his short life, and to investigate how his workshop functioned. Within a few years of the election of Giovanni de' Medici as Pope Leo X in 1513, Raphael would be architect of St. Peter's, in charge of the design of the tapestries in the Sistine Chapel, active as a designer of prints, engaged in an archaeological reconstruction of ancient Rome, all in addition to his day job of painting fresco cycles in the Vatican and other largely diplomatic commissions for his papal master. This level of production required massive organisation. In painting, his principal assistants were Giulio Romano and Gianfrancesco Penni, and these two painters inherited Raphael's commissions and contracts when the master died in 1520. Now, the output of Raphael's workshop was usually described as by Raphael, and when the role of assistants was acknowledged at all, it was in similarly generic ways. This was generally the aim of workshop production, and writing the first short biography of Raphael in about 1525, Paolo Giovio named his students, Francesco and Giulio, who are outstanding in this one choice quality, that they seem to emulate with great acuity and care the hand of their master, Raphael. Now there was, it seems, a contradiction here between notions of workshop style, which were essentially a continuation of 15th century practice, and newly crystallising 16th century ideas that valued personal authorship above all else. So the necessary development by Raphael of his workshop practice to meet ever-expanding demand was accompanied by a parallel reinterpretation of the nature of art, which criticised long-established practices of delegation within the workshop. The irony is that this occurred just as Raphael's art became more about design origination and less about execution, which was, as a result, increasingly delegated to his workshop. In the well-documented case of his portrait of Donna Isabel de Requesens, seen here on the left, Raphael explained that he had not sent the cartoon of this painting to the Duke of Ferrara as something by his hand, adding that when he had been asked to paint this portrait, he sent his boy to Naples to portray that lady, and had sent that portrait made by his boy to Alfonso d'Este. Now, while on the one hand this was no more than a pragmatic development of pre-existing, widely recognised workshop practice, ironically, the very change that Raphael was propagating could and did backfire in a dangerous whispering campaign against him. This was most vocal from his largely vanquished rivals for papal patronage. In a letter to Michelangelo of the 2nd of July 1518, two of Raphael's paintings, which had been sent to France, one of them, the St. Michael seen here on the right, was sharply criticised by Sebastiano del Piombo, and I quote, "It pains me that you were not in Rome to see the two pictures sent to France by Raphael. I believe you couldn't imagine a thing more contrary to your opinion than you would have seen in these works. I won't say more than it appeared that all the figures had been smoked or were instead figures of iron that shone, all lights and darks." This letter provides a very rare example of an immediately contemporary stylistic analysis and of the battle lines between these rival artists in Rome. Moreover, another correspondent of Michelangelo's could write in January 1519 that the Psyche loggia, seen here, in Agostino Chigi's villa, the Farnesina, was a shameful thing for a great master, worse than the last room of the stanze. These criticisms went wider than Michelangelo's circle. In an otherwise laudatory life of Raphael, Giorgio Vasari criticised the nudes of the stanza dell'Incendio as not in every way excellent. Similarly, his frescoes on the ceiling of Agostino Chigi did not give complete satisfaction, as they lack that grace and sweetness which were peculiar to Raphael, largely because he had them coloured by others after his design. It was in this febrile context that the double portrait in the Louvre was painted. Now widely known as Raphael's self-portrait with a friend, the identities of the two figures remain uncertain. What has united modern comment have been the related premises that, 1, the identity of the figures was important and is key to understanding the picture's meaning, and 2, that the physical and psychological relationship between the two figures must be a part of any identification, and so of the interpretation of the picture. I aim to demonstrate that Raphael has painted his self-portrait in the company of Giulio Romano, just before the former's death that saw Giulio inherit Raphael's workshop and assume his position as the leading painter in Rome. Amongst the ways in which one can then interpret this image are that it shows the older artist restraining the impetuous character of the younger master showing something to his teacher, as an allusion to a quasi-paternal relationship, a demonstration perhaps of the proposition of two artists, one hand, and I'll come back to this, or as a symbolic passing of the mantle from one generation to the next. All of these interpretations are part of the following discussion of this image, and it should be recognised that it is entirely typical of Raphael to paint a painting of such sophistication. The double portrait in the Louvre has been recorded in France from the early 17th century, and from 1683 the left-hand figure has been identified as Raphael's self-portrait. This bearded man wears a dark jacket and a cloak over a loose, wide-necked white shirt. He rests his left hand on the shoulder of the man in front of him, and his right forearm, where the dark sleeve tends towards purple hues, is visible in line with the other man's lower back. In fact, it almost seems to merge with the foreground figure's right arm. Several portraits or self-portraits of Raphael can be compared with the Louvre painting to establish the identity of this individual. Excluding some very youthful drawings, Raphael's earliest self-portrait is in the Uffizi, and he also painted himself in a rich red cloak in the School of Athens in the Stanza della Segnatura of the Vatican Palace in about 1509. Raphael's appearance towards the end of his life is confirmed by three complementary sources. An inscribed engraving by Giulio Bonassone, shown here, and Bonassone's teacher also made this engraving of a figure sitting alone beside a painting, wrapped in a voluminous dark cloak, which is probably a contemporaneous portrait of Raphael, as it has been described from the 17th century onwards. Both these likenesses of Raphael compare reasonably well with the left-hand figure in the Paris portrait, and tend to confirm the identification of the sitter. A further proof is apparently furnished by a frescoed roundel in the suburban villa of Baldassare Turini, the Villa Lante in Rome. Turini was a close friend of Raphael and one of the executors of the artist's will. The fresco decoration, which is usually attributed to Giulio Romano and his workshop, seems to have been executed in the 1520s. And so this was painted by Raphael's artistic heir and for one of his closest friends. The figure on the right in the Paris picture, who is also bearded but younger, is dressed in a not dissimilar fashion. He seems to wear a dark cloak over a creamy tailored shirt or jacket and a white undershirt. His left hand rests on the hilt of a sword, and his foreshortened right hand gestures out of the painting. He turns his head over his right shoulder to look up at his companion. There have been very many suggestions as to who this foreground figure might be. An anonymous fencing master, Baldassare Castiglione, Giovanni da Udine, Polidoro da Caravaggio, Baldassare Peruzzi, Antonio da Sangallo, Giovanna Battista dell'Aquila, Pietro Aretino, the list goes on. But the most convincing proposal is that he is Giulio Romano. Unfortunately, we don't know Giulio's date of birth, which is presumed to have been circa 1499, but some people push that date as late as 1492. So this picture was painted sometime when the figure who I am proposing was between 20 and 28 years old. Giulio apparently entered Raphael's workshop in the mid-1510s and was given significant independence by at least 1518, when he could be identified as the unnamed assistant largely responsible for the execution of the portrait of Donna Isabel de Requesens, which I showed earlier. We have no secure portrait or self-portrait of Giulio from his early Roman years. But Vasari remarked that Giulio had included himself in the donation of Constantine in the Sala di Costantino of the Vatican Palace, which was painted in 1524. There are reasonable grounds, I think, for identifying Giulio as the figure here in green in the left middle ground of the donation. This youthful figure has the curly dark hair, full beard and pronounced nose that is also found in the Paris portrait, which was painted just a few years earlier. Raphael's sitter can also be compared with Titian's portrait of Giulio in the Palazzo Ducale in Mantua, which was painted approximately 11 years later than the self-portrait in the donation of Constantine, and about 15 years after the Louvre double portrait. If the identifications of these two portraits in the Paris painting are correct, we can begin to explain the image. The relationship between the two figures is close, but it is also hierarchical. Both Raphael and Giulio were right-handed artists, and Raphael's right arm is in a position where it could be said to manipulate or even become Giulio's right hand. Could there be a play here on the idea of merged arms and the idea of two artists and one artistic hand or style? Raphael's left hand rests on the shoulder of the younger man. Vasari claimed that Raphael could not have loved Giulio more if he had been his own son, and there may have been more to this than rhetorical flourish. This close association with one's master had very deep roots and involved both tracing one's artistic inheritance and in some case the formal adoption of talented pupils. Adoption had become an important aspect of patronage in Rome, ancient and modern, and adopted sons were thought of as having been taken under the cloak of their adoptive patron. This practice continued in medieval Europe. Scottish law had the concept of mantle children, in German Mantelkinder, in French enfants de manteau. All of these terms used to describe adopted children. The usual purpose was the continuation of the family line and so the legitimization of an heir. But it was also associated with the elevation from a lower to a higher social status. Raphael's intense engagement with humanist scholars means that he would have known of these historic associations. And there's every reason to think he would also have known of the Old Testament connections as well. The modern sense of the English phrase passing on the mantle from one generation to the next has its roots in the Old Testament, where a cloak, a mantle, denoted leadership and was passed from Elijah to Elisha. The double portrait in Paris can then be seen, alongside other interpretations, as a symbolic bestowing of a cloak on Raphael's principal assistant. In Giulio's own will, which was made in 1524, he bequeathed a black cloak to Raffaellino del Colle, his closest artistic assistant. This legacy from Giulio to Raffaellino, and the possible origin of this in a gift from Raphael to Giulio, can be related to a broader practice of cloak-giving. In October 1523, another painter, Luca Signorelli, left a dark cloak to his artist nephew, Francesco Signorelli, with the instruction that this should be handed over immediately, presumably so that Francesco could wear it at the funeral and as a symbolic taking on of Luca Signorelli's mantle at that moment. In this context, Raphael's actions can be explained, and it seems that he is simultaneously operating through and adopting and elevating his brilliant pupil. The sword that Giulio rests his hand upon may be meant to suggest this elevation to a higher social status. One of the objections that has been made to identifying the left-hand figure as any one of the young artists proposed has been the presumption that a sword could only be carried by a man of higher rank. In fact, society was more porous. Another painter, Il Sodoma, purchased a sword that had belonged to a Milanese gentleman in 1506. And in the image seen here on the right, he shows himself wearing this newly acquired weapon and other items, including a long cloak, in the foreground of a fresco at Monte Oliveto Maggiore. And in the inventory of Giulio's own house, made in 1573, 6 swords were listed and meticulously described. I hope to have demonstrated that the double portrait in Paris that you see now shows Raphael and Giulio Romano. The picture tries to suggest that Raphael's workshop had many artists but only one hand or style, and it suggests Raphael's quasi-paternal role in Giulio's success, while recognising that the mantle would pass from one generation to the next, sooner, in fact, than either of them could possibly have guessed. Thank you.